Hello everybody, it's Kara from Wild Book Garden, and today I'm here with the third and final part of my November wrap-up. I will link parts 1 and 2 down below, as well as all the links and videos and people I mention, and content warnings too. So the first book I'm going to talk about is The Magic Fish by Trung Le Nguyen. This is a graphic novel that was a present from my lovely friend Olivia-Savannah from Olivia's Catastrophe, so thank you so much. I absolutely loved this. I've been hearing incredible things about it, so this really lived up to expectations. We're following our main character Tien, and he is Vietnamese, and one of the things that he grew up doing is like reading fairy tales and folk tales with his mother, and it was like a way for them to kind of meet in the middle because she spoke perfect Vietnamese but was working on her English, and he spoke perfect English but was working on his Vietnamese, and so this kind of gave them like this middle ground, and like it was a really close part of their relationship. But now that Tien is older, he is struggling to figure out how to come out to his mother, how to tell his family that he's gay. He's not even able to find a word that means gay in Vietnamese, so he really doesn't know how to do this, and eventually he figures out that he can kind of use these stories and his versions of these stories to maybe tell his mother this. And this was absolutely beautiful. I do really love the art and the color palette and the drawing style itself. I loved the use of fairy tales and the way that we see different takes on those and the way that different people have a slightly different lens on those. I love the way that this book talks about storytelling. I love the way it looks at family and generations and like where people come from and grief. I also love the way that these different characters and these different fairy tales and all of these things were layered kind of on top of each other. Like it kind of connected all of these pieces together in a way that was really effective but not confusing. I just really loved this, and I gave The Magic Fish 5 stars. Next, I finished a very short story, which was Tigerlilja by Erin Michelle Skye, and I think Stephen Brown is the other author. This is a, as I said, very short novella. This is in the Wendy series, or the Tales of the Wendy series. This is actually a prequel, so I read this kind of out of order, but it is the backstory for a character that we meet in one of the other books named Tigerlilja. She is the version of Tiger Lily, but she's not a native character in this version because, as I think pretty much everyone knows, the native representation in the original Peter Pan is atrocious. So yeah, this is like a kind of backstory for her, and I feel like it does do a good job of actually explaining some of the backstory that we maybe didn't have as much information for in the full-length novels. And there's not a lot to say about this one. I did really enjoy it. I love the writing of these authors, and I really like the use of like folklore and mythology here. So yeah, I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I'm glad I read it, and as I said, I do feel like it gave me some good information for the rest of the series. Next, I finished Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. I am so glad I finally read a Jennifer Saint book because I've been feeling like she's an author I would love, and thankfully this book proved me right because I did think this was fantastic. This is a historical fiction novel that is obviously a retelling of Ariadne's story, also known as, you know, Theseus and the Minotaur, or Ariadne and the Minotaur, Theseus and the Labyrinth, whatever you want to call it. But this is centering Ariadne and some of the other female characters, specifically her sister Phaedra, which I did not realize at the beginning, and at first when we get the first chapter from her, I'm like, okay, but wait, I don't know if I want this. I want to follow Ariadne, but I ended up really loving her perspective as well, and the way that the way this book talks about like women and misogyny and power, I just think it's fantastic. So the beginning of this book, we get a little bit of setup about Ariadne's life and like her family and Crete and everything, the beginning of the labyrinth, and then we see her helping Theseus escape and what kind of happens after that. Yeah, I thought this was fantastic. Like, I said this on Goodreads, and I'll say this again. This book actually does what The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker thinks it does. I really hated that book. It was supposed to be feminist, and it was one of the most actively anti-feminist, like, female-centered retellings that I've ever read. But I thought Ariadne was fantastic. I really enjoyed the writing style overall, and there were some really beautiful and poignant lines about stories and about who is centered in stories and like about women in storytelling, and I really like the way that it talks about like the way that women are talked about or not talked about in these myths and stories, and it felt like really thoughtful and like profound instead of being, I don't know, like overly obvious or like, you know, hitting you over the head with it. I just really liked this book. I think this book does a great job of like using, I don't know how to explain it. It's like using these sad parts and like using the like misogyny in ways that are feminist. So what I mean by that is you can have a book that is feminist and yet there are bad things that happen to female characters if the way you frame them is done well and in a certain way. And I feel like Ariadne really did that. I thought this was brilliant. I really liked the way that she used these myths and stories and interpreted them. As I said, was very invested in our main characters. I thought the themes were done just fantastically, so I gave Ariadne 4.5 stars, and I think I'm gonna enjoy her other books even more. I thought this was great. Also, I think this cover is absolutely stunning. This is the UK edition, because I almost always seem to prefer the UK edition. Next, I finished The Birchbark House by Louise Erdrich. This is the first book in a series. I don't remember what the series is called. We're following our main character Omakias, who is a young Ojibwe girl, and this is set around the time period that Little House on the Prairie is set in, so this book is often recommended as a good kind of like instead of or like companion book to that, because it's like similar time period but actually centering Native American characters. And I've never really gotten into Little House on the Prairie. Like, I maybe read one when I was little, so I don't really have that to compare it to. But I just wanted to mention that this is maybe a good option to consider. And this was, believe it or not, my first Louise Erdrich book, but I have finally read a book by her, and I really enjoyed this. This is a very slice of life story. We are following Omakias as her and her family just kind of live their lives. We see like the cycle of the year, and we also see their way of life being like most of it is not to do with that, but we do see a little bit about their way of life is being threatened by the white settlers who are coming in. And I did really enjoy this. I liked the writing. I really enjoyed Omakias as a main character. I thought the like family dynamics were really well done and really interesting. There were some moments of humor. I really enjoyed her pet crow. I think he was a crow. And I did feel very invested in this book. There are some very emotional parts, and I think the way that those emotional parts connected to the like history, like the things that were going on at this time with the settlers, I thought was really well done and really interesting. And I just enjoyed the story and getting to see this like Ojibwe just kind of slice of life story at this time period. So definitely recommend this, and I gave The Birchbark House 4.5 stars. Next, I finished White Rose by Kip Wilson. This is a novel in verse. It is based on the true story of Sophie Scholl, and also her brother and like a group of friends of theirs who were these student activists during Nazi Germany. So they were non-Jewish activists who were really pushing back against the Nazi Party, specifically at their university and through like distributing kind of flyers and things like that. And unfortunately, they and several others were executed. Sophie Scholl was very young. Her and her brother were both very young when they died, when they were killed by the Nazis. And so this book, it takes place partly during like the interrogation and trial, and then also partly as like kind of a flashback or like backstory. And as I said, this novel is in verse, so it is a very quick read. And this was a really interesting book. So Kip Wilson talks about like the research she did and the like personal letters and journals and everything that she based like her story on, her characterization on. And this was like I said, a very interesting book because there were some parts that I think it did very well. I think that this is obviously a very important story. I like that we had that kind of split point of view. And we also get some point of view poems from other characters as well, although Sophie is primarily the one that we're following. And I also like that this book talks about complicity, and the way that you can be a part of something and partly responsible for something even if you are not the one personally doing it. Like the way that like, you know, some of the Nazis just went along with things, and it's like, okay, but you're still part of genocide. And then Sophie, when she is talking about like how everybody's required to serve in some capacity for the Nazis, like for the military and everything, even if that is like in the reserves, or even if that is, I forget what her service was, but like that's the only way that you could go to university, and she really wanted to do that. That was something that was very important to her. So Sophie really struggles with like this almost implicit acceptance, like does the fact that she follows the rules and she does her service even though she wants to get out immediately, and even though she wants to do all of these things to right these wrongs, like does that make her, like how much does that make her part of the problem? Does that make her part of the problem? I thought that was very interesting. And also the trial scenes themselves I think were very well done and very effective. And I think Kip Wilson did a good job of like, in like the author's note and everything, talking about the importance of the story and the historical context and everything, and the things that did or didn't happen as a result of Sophie and her brothers and their friends' efforts. But I do think there were parts of this book that could have been a lot more effective. Like I haven't rated this one because I feel weird about it, because as I said, there were some parts that I think were very effective, but there were others that I think weren't. and that like the story is obviously very important, but I think it could have been an even more effective and important story if some of the writing things had been handled differently. Like, I wasn't the biggest fan of the writing style for the verse, but it was okay. But I didn't really like how we didn't get any development. Like, we didn't see any of the development of like Sophie realizing that the Nazis were wrong and horrible and deciding to go against them, like her decision to do that. Like, we get a glimpse of her and her brother when they were still like pro National Socialist Party and everything. Like, they were still like in favor of the Nazis. They thought they were doing good things. They said no, those stories about the other things they're doing aren't true. So we get a glimpse of that, but we don't get any information on that transition between that and where she ends up, which is fighting against the Nazi regime and everything. So I thought that was so odd, because it seems like such an important thing to include in this story about Sophie. And I just thought that was very odd. I think the story suffered for it, for not having any kind of indication of like why this happened, of like what made her change her mind, of like what specifically happened for her and her brother that changed their minds on that. Her brother was named Hans, by the way, I think. And yeah, like, I don't know if maybe Kip Wilson wasn't confident or like wasn't comfortable kind of like interpreting that. Like, maybe that information isn't in the papers that Wilson was working from. So I don't know, maybe there are reasons for it. I just wish that if there were, those reasons had been talked about, because otherwise I was like, this is a huge gap that we are missing in this story and in this character. Like, especially if we were going to see the like before she changed her mind, I think we needed to see why she did ultimately change her mind. And then also another thing, this is something that I have found in a few novels in verse, so this is not like specific to this book, but I think sometimes they can feel repetitive, and not all novels in verse do. Like, actually I'm going to talk about one in a minute that doesn't do that, but I think there is a tendency with some of these novels in verse to, because the themes are so prominent and the writing style is by necessity pared down, it can feel a little bit repetitive, especially because usually these books aren't as plot focused, so you're kind of going through the same kind of cycle of like emotions and themes and ideas, just like reworded slightly. And I feel like this book really did that. There were parts at least that really did that. So obviously I had kind of mixed feelings about this book. I'm glad I finally read it. I do think it's very important. And I knew a little bit about Sophie Scholl before this, and I definitely want to learn more about her. And I do think there are things this book did that it did very well. I think it's important, but it's just one of those cases for me where I think it could have been even more so if some of the writing choices had been different. But anyway, I would still definitely recommend it, and I think it is very much worth reading. And then finally, the last book I finished in the month of November is Jazz Owls, another novel in verse. This is a novel of the Zoot Suit Riots by Margarita Engel, art by Rudy Gutierrez. Oh, by the way, the illustrations, there are a few illustrations in the Louise Erdrich book that she actually did herself. So Jazz Owls is a very short novel in verse that is, as it says, a novel of the Zoot Suit Riots, which was a historical event that I had never heard about. I did not know anything about this. It was during World War II, a bunch of Navy sailors were home and like on shore leave basically in Los Angeles, and they end up attacking a bunch of Mexican American people, like beating them up. And this conflict is called the Zoot Suit Riots, which was kind of a way to pin the blame on these like young Mexican men because they wore these things called zoot suits, and like the way that clothing is like scapegoated is, I think, really interesting. I really like that this book touched on that. And so yeah, this novel is just about that. We are following several different characters. This book deals a lot with racism and xenophobia, and I really enjoyed this. This is by far my favorite Margarita Engel book that I've read so far, because I really loved the verse style throughout the book. In the other couple books I've read from her, it had felt a little more inconsistent to me, but I really enjoyed this one. This one did not have the repetitiveness problem that I have with some novels in verse. I thought that for being such a short book, we did get a pretty good idea of these different characters. I think the story was very compelling. I really appreciated the historical aspect of this and learning about this thing that I didn't know about before reading this book. And as I was saying earlier, I really like some of the subtleties that this book uses, like the way it talks about these zoot suits as like making these kids, you know, like thugs, and giving these white sailors an excuse to beat up people because of the way that they dress and things like that. And then another kind of subtle thing that this book does is it talks about the changeable nature of like whiteness basically, and how like Latin American, specifically in this case Mexican characters, are not treated as white by like other white people, but they are considered white when it comes to like anti-miscegenation laws. Like one of the characters in this book is in love with a black man, a black Latin American man, and they couldn't get married because she's considered white by the law, even though like she's not really treated as white. It was just very, very interesting. I would really recommend this one. It's, like I said, my favorite of her books I've read so far, and I gave Jazz Owls 4 stars. Okay, everybody, so those are finally all of the books that I read in November. I know I've been reading a lot, so there's been a lot of wrap-ups lately, but please comment down below and let me know if you have read any of these, what you thought of them, or if you're going to pick them up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!